Hello, and welcome back at another tutorial about the Korg wavestate. In this tutorial we are going to look at one of the more advanced features in the Korg wavestate, and that's called the mod processors. In the mod processors you can create your own envelopes and your own LFOs and assign that to any parameter of your choice in the wavestate. In the last tutorial we looked at the envelopes, the LFOs and the step sequencer, and how to assign them to the knobs of your choice or the features of your choice in the modulation matrix. In this tutorial we are going to take that a step further by using the mod processors and create our own envelopes and LFOs. And that's a really powerful feature, because now if we want to use LFOs we have only a few LFOs available with specific kind of movements, like a triangle, a saw down, or step down, square, all kind of basic things, random patterns. But it would be much more nicer if we can determine those patterns ourselves, and that's what we are going to do in the mod processor. So when we look at the mod processor you see this kind of complex diagrams. Basically what this does is that you can use these kind of functions to create your own source. And the best way to describe this is showing it in action. So let's load up an init performance. We select the init performance and we have the basic sound again. Okay, let's only use the first synth sound, so set a gate on the first slot. Now we have the synth sound. Okay, now one common thing you can do with an envelope is, for instance, do something like Xiaomi Zhia does and create a portamento sound type of sound from 24 plus 24 to minus 24, for instance. So let's create quickly an envelope that does that. We are going to use the filter envelope for this, but you can basically use any envelope you want, but let's use this one. And what we have now, let's remove the curves in it so that it's really nice. When it starts, it will take 3.4 seconds to get to the lowest amount. So let's assign this envelope to the tune and set it to that specific envelope. So we did this before in a previous tutorial, so I'm not going to explain this in detail anymore. And let's give it a value of 20 and let's see what happens. You hear it, you hear the effect that it's going up now from plus to minus. Let's add a reverb. Yeah. Okay, so basically it follows this pattern. We can make it slower. Or more quickly. Okay, but what you constantly hear in those Xiaomi Zhia songs or in other electronic songs is that it doesn't go this smoothly, but it takes little steps. So we don't have those kind of envelopes available. We only have 4 knobs to create this envelope. And we also don't have LFOs that does that kind of things. So that's where the mod processor comes in, because we want to create our own envelope that we can use on this tuning knob so that it doesn't run smoothly, but that it goes in steps. So let's do that. We have this filter envelope and we go to the mod processor 1 and we are going to take the quantize function. And the quantize function is basically that you can set the number of steps from the maximum to the minimum value. And we did create an envelope in the filter. So in the mod processor we are going to say the input is the filter envelope. because we created that envelope over here. So now we have created a quantize function on the filter envelope, and we are going to say, for instance, hey, I want 12 steps to create that specific behavior. Now, if you use it now, nothing will happen. You won't see any output in the mod processor. That's because it's not assigned to the tuning. So let's remove this filter envelope and now assign that mod processor to the tune knob. So if you do it now, it will get, it will use the source mod process 1, which is driven by the input of the filter envelope. So basically this envelope that we just heard, but it will add the quantize function on top of it. So it will modify that smooth curve to 12 steps. And let's hear how that turns out. So we can also see in this graph what it does. So we have, if you compare it with the filter and this one, this will show what your input value is, and this will what it basically creates on the 12 steps. So now we have created a much more interesting type of tuning. And if we create a faster filter, or much slower, and if we want less steps, for instance 6 or 2 or 3, or a much higher resolution, 24. So really interesting to use it this way. And you can do these things also on the cutoff filter or the panning, or well, things that you think as a sound designer is interesting to use. Let's remove it from the tuning and assign it to the cutoff filter now. We are going to use the mod processor for this and give it a high value. So let's up it. Yeah. Well, the syn doesn't have much harmonics, so let's use the saw crown for this and slow it down to hear it more in action. So now we have created that filter envelope with lots of steps. Make it 12 again. So now we've created our own envelope with a quantize function on this specific envelope. And you can draw that envelope any way you like. So that's really nice to do. Well, let's do it for an LFO, for instance, like this. You can apply it to anything you like. Then we say, hey, the input is not the filter envelope, but the filter LFO. And if you do it now, you get this large movement. But if we slow it down, for instance, or even slower, you can always see what's happening over here. So that's a really nice feature. But it applies to anything. So if you want to have a curve like this, and let's set it to the half, and then this, for instance, something like this. Set it to 50. So nice. Now it creates this curve with those steps. goes up again. So that's basically the function of the quantize function. But we have a lot more of these processing types. Another really interesting one is the sum function, for instance. And what you can do here is create a source and add another thing on top of that. So for instance, we could combine two LFOs or an envelope and LFO to create something unique. So let's do that. We have the filter LFO, which is basically a syn. And let's add a sawtooth on top of that. And so that we can create a specific kind of syn sound with those saw spikes on top of them. And that's basically what you can do with the mod processor. So if you are going to use now the source of the amp LFO, then we have combined the source of the filter LFO and the amp LFO. So we use the filter LFO as input and we add the sawtooth on top of that. So if we are going to do it now, you will get a syn tooth which uses those sawtooth on top of them. And the nice part is that you can determine the amount of each input and the effect on top of that. Or even the other way around. So we are creating our own envelopes and LFOs just by combining two sources together. And if you want to do the same, for instance, for that for the envelope and add the sawtooth on top of that envelope, you can do that also. Then just say, hey, the generator is the filter envelope or the amp envelope or whatever you like. And now it will follow this pattern, but adds those saw spikes on top of them. This is really cool to use, and you can determine your own kind of signature for your own sounds. So that's basically what the summing algorithm does. Then we have the gate feature, which is also a very nice one, and you can do all kind of crazy things with this. And let's say that we want to have the filter again, and let's add a simple triangle for this. And we have the mod processor assigned to the filter, and you play it now, then nothing will happen to the filter because we have to assign the control and what it does. And if we say, hey, we are going to use the filter envelope for this, or the filter LFO, then we have a threshold, and we have to say for what we are going to do above this threshold. So when it reaches that one, and below that threshold. So let's set it to specific sources. Let's set it to the filter LFO for both. And if you play it now, then it's the same as the normal filter LFO. So it follows this specific pattern. So that's nice, but we can also say, hey, I don't want that it goes so high. We want, for instance, that it cuts off at a value of 70, so that it's when it reaches, or 50, when it reaches 50, that it will always draw a straight line and not go further. So that we have created a small upwards pattern, a horizontal pattern, and then downwards, for instance. And you can do that in the mod processor by saying, hey, add the threshold. So let's set it to, for instance, 40. Let's type it in, that's easier. Use a fixed value of 40 so that it doesn't go higher. Now look at the graph now, and it will stay there and goes down again from 40 and up again till it reaches 40, and it will stay there. You can also say, hey, I want to have it at around 70, and we set this one also to the same amount. Or we say, hey, whenever it reaches 74 in this case, go back to 38. Another very interesting LFO that we created now. But it doesn't stop there. We also can say, hey, go to, for instance, 50. And whenever it reaches 50, then use a different LFO. And thus jump to a different LFO, like the pitch LFO. And we are going to say here, hey, use a random LFO at a completely different frequency. How cool is that? So when we are using it now, it will start with that filter. When it reaches 50, then for that period of time, it will use the pitch LFO with the random on 16th note, and then it will return again to that specific pattern. So let's see how that turns out. And goes down again. And you can tailor this completely to your own desire. Or a little bit higher, so that the effect is a little bit less. So this is really cool, and especially when you are going to use this in your own projects, you get things that nobody understands how you did it. And well, this is the trick how to do it. And let's add some delay on top of it. And that's really powerful, because you can really create your own LFOs and envelopes this way. And it doesn't really stop there. We created such a specific pattern now, but we can also say, hey, for the synthesis, don't use the mod processor 1, but use mod processor 2. In mod processor 2, we can use mod processor 1 to do those specific other things. So let's create something like the smoothness of the patterns that we are playing. We say, hey, the input is not now the LFO, but it's the mod processor 1, and we are going to add an attack and decay on top of each of those kinds of elements to make it more interesting. And now it's exactly the same, because we didn't have add an attack and a decay, but we are going to smooth that specific output of mod processor 1. So let's watch what happens. This is the original, and this is now with an attack and a decay on those specific square points, and we can make it as crazy as we want. Very nice pattern now. Or you set the decay to 0, then you get that it goes down quite quickly. But you still have the attack, or you do it the other way. You will get the attack, but a slow decay to return to the other value. So really powerful to do it this way, and there are a lot of things that you can use. The curve, for instance, is something that you can. Let me show that by using, for instance, not the mod processor one, but the filter LFO. That's much easier to explain. So what the curve will do is make this envelope a little bit smoother. So let's add a curve onto top of it. So this is the original. You see that it goes more. It adds a curve to the top. If you go down, it will do it the other way. And you can do it asymmetric. We also have the offset button, and what it does is that you can say, well, I want a lower level, that it goes lower, or an offset on top. So these are the kind of things you can do with the mod processor. Basically what you're going to do is create your own envelopes and LFOs with it and create your own signature sound. And it gives you lots of possibilities to add on top of all the values. For instance, now I created, let's use the mod processor one again. So we have that specific pattern that we created earlier, but we can also assign this, for instance, to the step sequencer. So if we only use step 1 and or even the pitch, let's do that, and add that specific mod process 1 to it. Now it will use the transpose with those kind of features. So you can do a lot of things with it, which are really nice to experiment with. So let me give a small example of how I use it in one of my patches, and I have lots of patches where I use it, but this one is easy to understand. If you are going to look at this patch now, then you see this mod processor creates a step pattern in a specific way, and it's assigned to the resonance, and that makes this sound more interesting than when you don't do that. And this is done with the quantize feature with 6 steps on the pitch envelope, where I created a specific envelope for that, and that envelope is applied to the resonance, and that gives it that little edge to that resonance on that synth pattern. So when you combine it with all the sounds, it just adds that little flavor that you need. Okay, so I have one little last tip. In the manual there is a fantastic section about the mod processors, and with lots of diagrams of how this works. And you've heard now in action how to apply it to all kind of parameters and how you can create it yourself. So my guess is that you will understand that section of the manual much better now you know how to apply it and how it works. So I hope this helps, and see you in the next tutorial.